Perception is not reality. And this is really important to understand if we want to be successful solving real world problems, discovering those literal and metaphorical treasures in our lives, in our work, in our gameplay, and in other things like that. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a history tour on this idea of the phrase perception is reality, and then we're going to dive into what was meant by it and what was not meant by it. And I think you'll find this pretty helpful. So let's dive in here. So where did this phrase come from? I can't find the exact origin, like the first time that someone wrote it or spoke it and then it was quoted. It's a little bit hard, but it isn't that old of a phrase. At least the direct phrase comes from sort of 20th century business and public relations literature, some political literature, advertising culture, things like that. And it appears frequently in things like campaign strategy memos or other kinds of public relation manuals that there might exist with a certain company or something like that. But that's really where it came from. And there are a number of names that are attached to it, and I'm not even going to go through that list. There are about 4 or 5 people that many people attribute to being the possible origin source. But since I don't know exactly which one is the real one, I'm just going to leave that out for now. The closest scholarly root that I can find that kind of goes back to some kind of scholarly source, and it's not exactly the phrase perception is reality, is a guy named Thomas Theorem in 1928. And the quote was this: "If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequence." So if men define a situation as real, they're real in their consequence. So the idea is that it doesn't mean that what you perceive makes something real. It simply means that if you define a certain thing as real, you're going to start to behave and act as if it's real, and that will shape your behavior, and that can actually shape the environment. It can have consequences down the road. And that's where perception as reality is a useful phrase if we understand that important nuance. So let's kind of dive in a little bit more to this, but I will note this, that it is really more, I would say the phrase perception as reality is really more of a slogan than it is some kind of philosophical maxim. So here are a few things of what it actually means in the correct sense. So it's meant to be a descriptive statement about human behavior. People act on what they believe, not on what is objectively true. That's part of what the statement is meant to communicate. So when we say perception is reality, we mean that people act on what they believe to be true, not on what is actually true. So let's imagine, I remember this story. It was meant to be kind of a powerful story. It was used in a devotion in a church that I attended one time. And it was about this boy who was deathly allergic to bumblebees. And the father was driving in the front seat. The boy was in the back, and a bee flies through the window, and it's going right toward the boy. And the boy is panicked, and the father reaches back, and he grabs the bee. And then he just lets the bee go again. The bee goes straight toward the little boy. The boy's panicking, and the boy's like, "Dad, don't you care? This bee, if it stings me, I could die." And the father's response was, "No, son, it can't hurt you anymore. It already stung me." Now, imagine that you are in that back seat, and you're the boy. To the boy, perception is reality, so he perceives the bee to be a threat to his life, even after the father lets him go. And the boy could have reacted in some kind of drastic way. He could have jumped out of the car while it was moving to try to escape the bee and hurt himself even worse. He could have done different things. So even though the bee had no stinger left and the bee couldn't hurt, the boy was perceiving the bee as a danger, and so he could have acted as if it were a danger. That is where perception as reality makes a lot of sense. Now stay with me, because this has a lot of relevance for decision-making, problem-solving, other things like that. So it also means that misperceptions can generate real-world consequences, as I just indicated. So if you are trying to solve a problem and you have just convinced yourself that something is true and it's really not, that is going to completely sidetrack where you go. It's not going to lead you to the right direction. And that's why I talk so much about different cognitive biases on this channel. They're all about misperceptions, misconceptions of reality. So that's what this phrase, perception as reality, can mean, is that when you have a misperception, it can actually have real world consequences. And that's important for us to know. That's why we want to avoid misperceptions. Sometimes what's interesting, though, is the phrase has been used as a justification almost for perception over reality, and that's where it hurts us. Third point here is just that leaders have to manage communication, and they have to be careful what they say and how they say it, because different people are going to interpret and perceive the truth claims differently. That also is where the phrase has some value. As a leader of an organization and as a leader in different roles throughout my life, there are many times where I communicate something and people hear different things. In fact, I actually did a study one time, and I used to teach a grad class where I required students to do this. They had to go to a church and talk to a pastor about the message the pastor intended to give that Sunday, and ask the pastor, what are your main points? What are your main lessons? And then after the church service, the assignment was to interview 10 people and ask them what main lesson they heard. Never, not once in this assignment, I've probably given it to 400 students over the years, not once did I ever have a student come back with even more than 2 or 3 people who heard the same message. So that's where the perception as reality kind of fits and makes sense. It reminds us of the reality, the fact that people are going to experience the same thing. They'll interpret it differently. They'll make different conclusions, and that will shape how they respond to that, how they react to it. This perception as reality is sometimes used to acknowledge the idea that a lot of our social interactions and how we treat one another, how we talk to one another, it's not necessarily based on what's really true or real. It's based on what we think is true or real. So in that sense, perception is reality. Yes, absolutely. There is some truth to it. But here's what it doesn't mean. And a lot of people seem to have confused it, and they make it mean these things. The first thing, it does not mean that perception creates objective truth. So in other words, if you are on a treasure hunt and you really think or believe that a treasure is in a certain place, it doesn't cause the treasure to move from its actual location to the place where you believe it or want it to be. That's not what this phrase means, and that's not how the world tends to work. The second is, it does not mean that reality is irrelevant or optional. We live in this kind of world where people's images of themselves and image of different things around, that there's a lot, we sort of lead with opinion before truth seeking, before real careful observation. Actually, the ancient word wisdom can be interpreted from the Hebrew as a listening heart. And that's a heart that doesn't start by guessing, by telling stories, by making up what you want to believe to be true, but it's actually a really candid, honest listening and trying to see what's really real, trying to understand reality as it actually is, not as we want it to be. It's also, this phrase does not mean that all perceptions are equally valid. That also is something that people think is maybe a kind way of approaching the world, that if all perceptions are equally valid. But the problem with that is it hurts people in the long run. Because what if some perceptions are violent or cruel or harmful? What if some perceptions could lead you to make decisions that could be harmful for you physically or in other ways as well? That's why this phrase can be abused or misused, and I think it often does get used that way. This phrase, perception as reality, does also not mean, it does not remove your responsibility for actually seeking the truth. It can be this kind of shortcut, this harmful shortcut where you don't do the hard work of trying to grapple with uncertainty, trying to figure things out, accepting the fact that your perception can be wrong and that you want to get toward the thing that is most true. Because the more you can kind of face that reality, the better chance you have of solving the real problem, of discovering the real or metaphorical treasure. And then also, this phrase does not imply some kind of post truth relativism. So there are some people today who would argue that there is no such thing as objective truth or objective reality. And this channel, I don't really deal with that, because that concept is also just pragmatically, it's not very helpful. So for example, imagine that you're standing at a crossroad and there's traffic that's flying by, and you have to get across this very, very busy highway. And you say to yourself, well, there's really no objective truth. And so I'm just going to believe that I can walk straight across this street safely. And you walk right across the street in front of a fast moving car that's coming at you at 80 miles per hour. In that moment, perception and truth are going to have a battle. And truth is going to win very quickly. And it will be to the detriment of that person. And that's why it's really, really important to recognize that when it comes to real problem solving and treasure hunting, metaphorical and literal, and that kind of thing, perception really isn't reality, at least not in the way that people sometimes misconstrue it today. So with that said, I hope you find this useful, and I look forward to your comments.